Family recipes are a precious thing, a link to our heritage, a taste of the past lovingly handed down through generations. They're a mixture of comfort, tradition, and love. But what if a family's most treasured recipe was a testament not to love, but to a possessive, unspeakable evil? What if the secret ingredient, the one that made a mother-in-law's pastries the talk of the town, was a horror beyond all imagining? Tonight, we slice into a story of domestic terror, where a young bride's dream of a new family becomes a nightmare of being consumed by it, quite literally. This is a story that will curdle your blood and change the way you look at a homemade pie forever. Before we serve up this tale of culinary horror, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You need to be with us for every chilling bite of this story. Clara's new life was supposed to be a pastoral dream, a return to simpler things. When her husband, Thomas, had suggested they move back to his ancestral home to care for his aging mother, she had been hesitant but ultimately optimistic. She imagined bucolic weekends, learning the rhythms of the countryside, and finally connecting with the woman who had raised the kind, gentle man she loved. The house itself, a sprawling, two-story Victorian named The Gables, was beautiful from a distance, a postcard from a bygone era. But as they drove up the long gravel driveway, Clara felt the first, inexplicable prickle of unease. The house didn't feel welcoming, felt watchful. Her mother-in-law, Beatrice, was waiting for them on the porch. She was a woman who seemed carved from hardwood, tall, straight-backed, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes the color of a winter sky. She smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a smile of possession, not of welcome. "Thomas, my boy," she said, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She embraced her son, ignoring Clara for a long moment. Finally, she turned. "And you must be Clara. Welcome to the Gables." The inside of the house was a museum of a life Clara had no part in. Every surface was covered with lace doilies and sepia-toned photographs of Thomas's ancestors, their severe, unsmiling faces staring down at her. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, potpourri, and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet, like old blood or overripe fruit. It was the smell of a place sealed against the modern world. Beatrice was, on the surface, the perfect matriarch. She was impeccably polite, her movements graceful and deliberate. But her kindness was a brittle veneer over a core of unbendable iron. She ran her house with a quiet, absolute authority. There were rules, unspoken but strictly enforced. Certain rooms were not to be entered. Certain topics were not to be discussed. And above all, no one but Beatrice was ever allowed to cook in her kitchen. The kitchen was her throne room. It was an enormous, old-fashioned space with a massive, cast-iron stove and a butcher's block in the center that was the size of a small bed. The wood of the block was dark and scarred with the cuts and scrapes of a century of use. Beatrice spent most of her days here, and it was from this domain that her local fame emanated. She was renowned throughout the county for her baking, especially her savory meat pastries. People would drive for miles to buy them at the annual town bake sale. "The recipe is a family secret, of course," Beatrice explained to Clara during that first week, her hands deftly kneading a massive ball of dough. "Passed down from my great-grandmother. The key is in the filling. You need the absolute freshest ingredients and a tender touch." She smiled that thin, cold smile again, and Clara felt a shiver trace its way down her spine. Thomas, for his part, was blissfully blind to the oppressive atmosphere. To him, this was just home. The strange smells, his mother's rigid control, the house's suffocating stillness, it was all just the comforting background noise of his childhood. When Clara tried to gently broach the subject of his mother's coldness, he would become defensive. "That's just how she is, darling," he'd say, patting her hand. "She's from a different generation. She just needs time to warm up to you. Try one of her pasties, you'll feel better. They can solve anything." So Clara tried. She ate the pastries, which were, she had to admit, delicious. The crust was flaky and buttery, and the filling was rich, savory, and complex, with a unique, slightly sweet flavor she couldn't quite identify. But every time she took a bite, she felt Beatrice's cold, assessing eyes on her, and the food would turn to ash in her mouth. She felt like she was being fattened for some unknown purpose. The unsettling incidents started small. Clara had a favorite silk scarf, a gift from her late mother. One day, it vanished from her room. When she asked Beatrice if she'd seen it, the older woman's eyes went completely blank. "A scarf, dear? No, I haven't seen any scarf. You must be more careful with your things. This is an old house. Things get lost." 2 days later, Beatrice was in the garden, tying her prize-winning rose bushes to a trellis. She was using thin strips of brightly colored silk. From a distance, they looked just like Clara's scarf. When Clara got closer, Beatrice had already finished, and Clara couldn't be sure. She told herself she was imagining things. Then there was the incident with the pantry. It was a large, walk-in closet off the kitchen, with a heavy oak door that Beatrice kept locked at all times. "Pests, dear," she had explained. "Can't be too careful." One afternoon, Clara was passing by when she heard a strange noise from within. It was a faint, rhythmic thumping sound. She pressed her ear to the door. The thumping stopped. She heard a soft, wet, dragging sound, and then silence. A wave of revulsion and fear washed over her. Later that evening, Beatrice emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of her famous pastries, ready for the church bake sale. The smell was richer and more intense than ever. "A new batch," she announced, "made with a very special cut today." Thomas was planning a small dinner party to introduce Clara to some of his old friends from town. Clara saw it as an opportunity, a chance to have other people in the house, to break the suffocating spell of Beatrice's control. She offered to help with the cooking. "Perhaps I could make a dessert?" she suggested brightly. "I have a wonderful recipe for a lemon tart." Beatrice stopped what she was doing and turned to face Clara. For the first time, the mask of polite indifference dropped, revealing an expression of pure, venomous fury. "No one," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "cooks in my kitchen. Do you understand me? You are a guest here, Clara. A guest in my son's home. You would do well to remember that." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as shards of glass. Thomas, who had walked in at that moment, just laughed nervously. "Mother, don't be so dramatic." Clara was only trying to help. But Beatrice's eyes never left Clara's face. They were flat and cold and held a look of profound, terrifying appraisal, like a butcher sizing up a prize-winning pig. In that moment, Clara understood that she was not a guest. She was an intruder, and she was in terrible, terrible danger. The pastoral dream had died, replaced by the chilling certainty that she was living in a monster's den. And the monster wore an apron. The dinner party was a suffocating affair. Thomas's friends were polite but distant, their conversations circling around old inside jokes and shared memories that left Clara feeling like an alien anthropologist studying a strange, closed-off tribe. Beatrice presided over the evening like a queen, serving her famous savory pastries as the main course. As Clara watched the guests bite into the flaky crust, their faces alight with pleasure, a wave of nausea rolled over her. She couldn't shake the memory of the thumping sound from the locked pantry. She picked at her food, unable to swallow a single bite. Her chance to learn more came from an unexpected source. One of the guests, a woman named Eleanor who had been a childhood friend of Thomas's, followed Clara to the powder room. She was a kind-faced woman whose eyes held a flicker of sympathy. "Don't mind them," Eleanor said in a low voice, nodding back towards the dining room. "They've always been a bit cliquey. And Beatrice, well, she's an acquired taste." "She doesn't seem to have acquired a taste for me," Clara replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Eleanor gave a sad, knowing smile. "She never does. Not for any of Thomas's friends." She paused, then seemed to make a decision. "You're not the first, you know." "The first what?" Clara asked, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "The first woman Thomas has brought home to the Gables," Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting towards the door as if Beatrice might materialize out of the floral wallpaper. There was another. Years ago, a girl named Amelia, his fiancée. Clara stared at her, stunned. Thomas had never mentioned another fiancée. What happened to her? She asked. No one really knows, Eleanor said, twisting a napkin in her hands. It was all very sudden. She and Thomas were inseparable, planning their wedding. She spent a lot of time here at the house. Beatrice was particularly attentive to her. Then one day she was just gone. Thomas was heartbroken. The story was that she got cold feet and ran off. A letter arrived a week later from somewhere on the West Coast, saying she had left him and not to look for her. But it was always strange. Amelia wasn't the type to just run away without a word. Eleanor leaned closer. The strangest part was the timing. She disappeared just before the annual harvest festival. It's the biggest event of the year in town. Beatrice always bakes hundreds of her pastries for it. That year, everyone said her pastries were the best they'd ever been. Richer, more flavorful. A cold, horrifying thought began to form in the deepest, darkest recess of Clara's mind. A thought so monstrous she immediately tried to shove it away. It was insane. It was impossible. But the seed was planted. In the weeks that followed, Clara's life became a paranoid tightrope walk. She started observing Beatrice with a new, fearful intensity. She noticed things she hadn't before. She saw the unnatural, vibrant green of the vegetable patch behind the house. A patch Beatrice tended to with a fanatical devotion, using a special, homemade fertilizer she kept in a locked shed. She noticed the collection of antique knives mounted on a magnetic strip in the kitchen, boning knives, cleavers, flensing knives, all kept sharpened to a razor's edge. She began to have nightmares. Dreams of the locked pantry door, of the rhythmic thumping, of a beautiful, terrified girl with a face she'd never seen, but who she knew was Amelia. She would wake up in a cold sweat, Thomas sleeping soundly beside her, oblivious to the terror that was slowly consuming his wife. Her fear drove her to do something she never thought she'd do. She began to spy. She knew Beatrice's routine by heart. Every Tuesday, Beatrice drove into the next town for supplies. It was the only time she ever left the house for more than an hour. The Tuesday after the dinner party, as soon as Beatrice's car disappeared down the driveway, Clara sprang into action. Her target was the locked pantry. She had found a ring of old, skeleton keys in a dusty box in the attic. She worked frantically, her hands shaking, trying key after key in the heavy iron lock. None of them worked. In a fit of desperate frustration, she rattled the doorknob, and to her astonishment, it turned. Beatrice hadn't locked it, or she had forgotten. The smell hit her first. It was the same smell that permeated the house, but 100 times more concentrated. The cloying, sweet and metallic scent of decay. The pantry was deep and windowless. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and hanging bundles of dried herbs. At the far end of the narrow room stood a massive, industrial-grade meat grinder, bolted to a heavy wooden table. Next to it, on the floor, was a large, dark stain on the wooden floorboards, a stain that had been scrubbed at but not entirely removed. Her eyes scanned the shelves, looking for anything, any proof that her horrifying suspicions were not just madness. She saw a wooden crate tucked away on the highest shelf, half hidden behind some sacks of potatoes. It was the only thing in the meticulously organized pantry that seemed out of place. Her heart pounding, she dragged a stool over and climbed up. She pulled the crate down. It was heavy. She pried open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, were not ingredients, but mementos. A small silver locket. A book of poetry with a handwritten inscription on the inside cover. To my dearest Amelia, forever yours, Thomas. And at the very bottom, a single elegant woman's shoe. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. It was all real. But the most terrifying discovery was not in the crate. It was next to it. Lying on the shelf was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was a ledger of some kind. She opened it. The pages were filled with Beatrice's neat, precise handwriting. It was a list of names, each followed by a date and a number. The first entry was from decades ago. There were a dozen names in total, all female. The last name on the list was Amelia Rosewood. The date next to her name was from 5 years ago, a week before the annual Harvest Festival. And the number next to her date was 180 pounds. It was a butcher's ledger. A wave of vertigo washed over Clara. She stumbled back, dropping the book. She had to get out. She had to tell Thomas. He had to believe her now. She scrambled out of the pantry, her mind screaming. She ran through the kitchen, but as she reached the hallway, she heard the sound of a car on the gravel driveway. Beatrice was back early. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. She heard the front door open and close. She heard Beatrice's slow, deliberate footsteps in the hall. She was trapped. Beatrice's voice called out, calm and pleasant. "Clara, dear? I'm home. I forgot my shopping list. I brought back something special for dinner. I do hope you're hungry." Clara's mind raced, a frantic animal caught in a snare. There was nowhere to run. The back door was through the kitchen, where Beatrice would surely see her. The stairs to her bedroom felt a million miles away. Acting on pure, primal instinct, she ducked into the small, dark space of the coat closet in the hallway, pulling the door shut until it was open just a crack. She held her breath, praying the old hinges wouldn't creak. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, so loud she was certain Beatrice could hear it. Through the crack, she watched as her mother-in-law entered the kitchen. Beatrice placed a heavy shopping bag on the table, but her movements seemed off. She wasn't humming her usual tune. She stood for a moment perfectly still, her head cocked as if listening to the silence of the house. A sixth sense, honed by decades of predatory behavior, seemed to be telling her something was wrong. Her gaze swept the room and then, with a chilling deliberation, landed on the pantry door. Clara saw it from her hiding place. The door was not quite flush with the frame. In her panicked exit, she hadn't closed it completely. It was ajar by less than an inch, an almost imperceptible error, but to a woman like Beatrice, it was a screaming alarm. A slow, cold smile spread across Beatrice's face. It was not her usual thin, polite smile. This was a real one, and it was the most terrifying thing Clara had ever seen. It was a smile of satisfaction, of a game reaching its exciting conclusion. Beatrice didn't go to the pantry. She didn't call out Clara's name. Instead, she turned and walked calmly back into the living room, a place that would put her directly between Clara and the front door, the only route of escape. She had blocked the exit. The trap was sprung. Clara knew she was no longer just a suspecting daughter-in-law. She was prey. The game of subtle intimidation was over, and the hunt had begun. She couldn't stay in the closet forever. She had to get to Thomas. He was at his office in town. She had to get to a phone. Her own cell phone was on the nightstand in her bedroom, an impossible distance away. There was an old rotary phone in the study, which was just off the living room where Beatrice now sat, waiting. It was an impossible choice. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow. After what felt like an eternity, Clara heard the gentle creak of the living room armchair, followed by the soft rustle of a newspaper. Beatrice was settling in. This was her chance. Moving with a silence born of sheer terror, Clara eased the closet door open and slipped out. She stayed low, using the furniture in the long hallway as cover, her stockinged feet making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. She could see Beatrice through the wide doorway of the living room, her back partially to her, seemingly engrossed in her paper. The study was just past the living room on the same side of the hall. If she could just get past the doorway without being seen. She took a deep, silent breath and darted across the open space. She made it. She slipped into the cool, dark, book-lined study and gently pushed the door, leaving it open just enough to see out. The phone was on the massive oak desk at the other end of the room. She crept towards it, her eyes still fixed on the sliver of the living room she could see. She reached the desk and lifted the heavy, black receiver. There was no dial tone. She jiggled the switch hook. Nothing. The line was dead. She looked down and saw that the cord had been cleanly, deliberately severed, a fresh cut in the old, fabric-covered wire. A new wave of pure, cold horror washed over her. This wasn't a sudden decision. Beatrice had been planning this. She had known this confrontation was coming. The early return, the dead phone linite, was all part of the trap. Clara's eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, an escape route. The windows were old, sash-style, and looked like they had been painted shut for decades. Then her eyes landed on something on the corner of the desk. It was a large, leather-bound book, similar to the butcher's ledger she had found in the pantry, but much older and more ornate. The title was embossed in faded gold leaf on the cover. The Gables Cookbook, a matron's guide to family and feasting. Her blood ran cold, but she couldn't stop herself. She opened it. The pages were thick, creamy parchment, filled with elegant, spidery script passed down through generations. It was filled with recipes for jams, roasts, and breads, and pastries. She found the chapter on savory pies and pastries. Her hands trembling, she turned to the page for Beatrice's famous harvest meat pie. The recipe was written like a beautiful, macabre poem. It listed ingredients like butter, flour, and herbs. But then it came to the filling. It was written in a chilling, euphemistic code. First, select your stock. The recipe began. A young heifer is best, one that is healthy and well-fed, with a spirit that is not yet broken. This ensures the meat is tender and full of life. The stock should be brought into the home and made comfortable, allowed to acclimate to its new surroundings. This period of settling is crucial for the final flavor. Clara felt a sob catch in her throat. Heifer. Settling. She read on, her horror mounting with every word. The harvest should be done with care and respect, always in the week before the festival. Waste is a sin. Every part of the stock has its purpose. The prime cuts, of course, are for the filling. They should be ground fine twice for a delicate texture. The lesser cuts can be used for broths and jellies. The bones, when properly cleaned and boiled, make a rich and fortifying stock. The secret to the unique sweetness of our filling, the passage continued, is a pinch of sentiment. A small, personal item from the stock, a lock of hair, a shred of fabric from a favorite garment should be burned and the ashes folded into the spice blend. It binds them to the family. It makes them a part of our legacy. They nourish us, and in turn, we remember them forever. It was all there, a generations-long tradition of cannibalistic murder, disguised as a family cookbook. Amelia hadn't just been killed. She had been processed. Her final terror and essence had been folded into the pastries that the whole town had devoured with relish. Clara slammed the book shut, a gagging sound escaping her lips. At that exact moment, she heard the rustle of the newspaper cease in the living room. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror. Beatrice was standing in the doorway of the study, perfectly silent, the newspaper hanging from one hand. The cold, satisfied smile was back on her face. "So," Beatrice said, her voice soft and pleasant, as if commenting on the weather, "you've finally read the family recipe. I was wondering when you'd show an interest in my cooking. Now you know our secret. Now you know what an honor it is to be chosen. Every generation, the family must be revitalized. My Thomas needs a strong family. And you, my dear, are going to make a wonderful contribution." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The genteel, book-lined study transformed into a cage, and the woman standing in the doorway was no longer just a cold, controlling mother-in-law. She was a high priestess of a monstrous, generational cult, and Clara was the designated sacrifice. "You're insane," Clara whispered, her voice a reedy, trembling thing. She backed away from the desk, her eyes darting around for an escape she knew didn't exist. "Insanity is a matter of perspective, my dear," Beatrice replied, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. She was unervingly calm. "What you see as madness, I see as tradition, as legacy, as love. My son is everything to me. His strength, his vitality, comes from this family, from this house. He is nourished by the women who come here. We take them in and they become a permanent part of him. Part of us. It's a beautiful symbiosis. Really? Clara's mind reeled. The pastries. Thomas had eaten them his entire life. He had eaten Amelia. The thought was so grotesque, so profoundly violating, that she felt a wave of nausea. Thomas. Does he know? Clara choked out, clutching the heavy cookbook to her chest like a shield. Does he know what you are? What you do? A flicker of something annoyance? Disappointment? Crossed Beatrice's face. Thomas knows what he needs to know. He knows that his mother loves him and provides for him. He knows that our family has traditions that must be upheld. He is a good son. He doesn't ask unnecessary questions. She took another step into the room. He understands that sometimes women leave. They are flighty, unreliable creatures. Like Amelia, she was disappointing. So much spirit, but it broke too easily. In that moment, Clara understood the most terrible truth of all. Thomas wasn't just blind. He was a willing participant in his own ignorance. His denial was a form of complicity. He was the butcher's son, content to eat the meat without ever asking where it came from. He was not her savior. He was the entire reason for the altar on which she was about to be sacrificed. Adrenaline, pure and sharp, cut through her fear. She was alone. If she was going to survive, it would be up to her and her alone. She lunged, not for the door where Beatrice stood, but to the side, towards the heavy velvet curtains covering the window. She ripped at them, her fingers fumbling with the old, painted-shut lock. Beatrice moved with a speed that belied her age. She grabbed Clara by the arm, her grip like a steel vice. "There will be no fuss," she hissed, her voice losing its pleasant veneer, revealing the cold, hard cruelty beneath. "It spoils the meat." Clara screamed and twisted, bringing the heavy, leather-bound cookbook up and smashing it into the side of Beatrice's head. The older woman grunted in pain and surprise, her grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Clara wrenched her arm free and scrambled away, putting the massive oak desk between them. A thin trickle of blood ran from Beatrice's temple, but she seemed not to notice. Her eyes were alight with a terrifying, predatory fire. The mask was completely gone now. This was the true Beatrice, the butcher in the apron. "You have spirit?" she said, a strange, admiring tone in her voice. "Good. That will add to the flavor." Just then, they both heard it, the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. Thomas. He was home early. A flicker of hope, desperate and irrational, ignited in Clara's chest. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe, when faced with the undeniable, monstrous truth, he would help her. "Thomas!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Thomas, help me!" Beatrice's expression soured. "So tiresome," she muttered. She straightened her dress, wiped the blood from her temple with the back of her hand, and composed her features into a mask of maternal concern. The front door opened. "Mother? Clara? I'm home. What's all the shouting?" Thomas's voice called out. "In the study, dear," Beatrice called back, her voice once again warm and steady. "Clara is having one of her episodes. She's not feeling well at all." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face a picture of confusion. He took in the scene. The overturned chair, the cookbook on the floor, the wild, terrified look in his wife's eyes, and his mother standing calmly, dabbing at a small cut on her head. "What in God's name is going on?" he asked. "Thomas, you have to listen to me," Clara cried, her words tumbling over each other. "Your mother. She's a monster. Amelia didn't run away. She killed her. She's in the cookbook. It's all in the cookbook." She pointed a trembling finger at the book on the floor. Thomas looked from Clara's frantic face to his mother's pained, weary one. "Oh, my dear boy," Beatrice said, her voice trembling with manufactured hurt. "She's become completely delusional. She attacked me. She's been saying the most awful, insane things about our family, about our traditions. They're not traditions. They're recipes for murder." Clara shrieked. "Look at the book, Thomas. Just look at it." Thomas stared at the book on the floor, his face pale and conflicted. He looked at his wife, her beautiful face streaked with tears and terror. Then he looked at his mother, the woman who had raised him, who had cared for him, who had fed him his entire life. He saw the cut on her head. He saw her look of weary sadness. And he made his choice. "Clara, that's enough," he said, his voice cold and hard. He walked over to his mother and put a protective arm around her. "You need to calm down. You're hysterical. You attacked my mother." The last flicker of hope in Clara's heart died. He had chosen. He had chosen the monster. He had chosen the cage. She looked at his face, at the deliberate, willful ignorance in his eyes, and she finally saw him for what he was. Not a victim, but a component of the machine. He was the engine that it all ran for. He was the butcher's son. "I'm going to call Dr. Matthews," Thomas said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "He can give you a sedative. You need to rest." "She's not hysterical, Thomas," Beatrice said softly, patting his arm. "She's just unsuitable. I see that now. It's a shame. I had such high hopes." She looked over Thomas's shoulder at Clara, and her eyes were full of a cold, pragmatic finality. It was the look of a chef deciding that an ingredient has spoiled and must be thrown out, or in this case, replaced. Clara knew then that there would be no doctor. There would be no sedative. There would only be the pantry, the butcher's block, and the rich, sweet filling for the harvest festival pies. She was utterly, completely alone, trapped in a house with two monsters. One who would kill her with a knife, and one who would kill her with his silence. The world shrank to the confines of the study. Thomas stood by the door, a human barrier, his face a mask of resolute denial. He had made his choice, and in doing so, had become his mother's accomplice. He was the jailer. Beatrice, having won, retreated to the kitchen. Clara could hear her humming, the soft, melodic sound a chilling counterpoint to the silent, screaming terror in the room. She could hear the rhythmic, heavy thump of a cleaver hitting the butcher's block, a sound of preparation, a promise of what was to come. Clara looked at the man she had married, a stranger with a familiar face. "Thomas, how can you do this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "How can you let her?" "Let her what?" he replied, his voice flat, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "Let her care for our family? Let her uphold our traditions? Clara, you're ill. You need help. Mother knows what's best." "What's best?" she repeated, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. "She's sharpening her knives for me, Thomas. The harvest festival is in 2 days. Don't you understand what that means?" "It means my mother will be very busy baking," he said, his voice clipped. The denial was a wall of steel, impenetrable. He had to believe she was mad, because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. To admit the truth would be to admit that his entire life, his very substance, had been built upon a foundation of horror and human sacrifice. It was easier to believe his wife was crazy than to believe his mother was a cannibal. Clara knew then that pleading was useless. She had to think. She had to fight. She looked around the study again, her eyes frantic. The fireplace. It was old, bricked, and hadn't been used in years. But every fireplace had a chimney. It was a slim chance, a desperate, insane idea, but it was the only one she had. She had to create a diversion. Her eyes fell on a heavy, brass letter opener on the desk, shaped like a miniature sword. She grabbed it. "If you won't listen to reason, then you'll have to listen to this," she said, her voice taking on a hard, desperate edge. She pointed the letter opener at her own throat. "Let me walk out of this house, or I swear, I'll do it right here. And your mother will lose her freshest ingredient." Thomas's eyes widened in alarm. This was a variable he hadn't considered. "Clara, don't be ridiculous. Put that down. Open the door and walk away, Thomas," she screamed, pressing the tip of the opener against her skin, a tiny bead of blood welling up. At that moment, Beatrice appeared in the doorway, a rolling pin in her hand, her apron spattered with flour. "Such a fuss," she said with a sigh. "Thomas, dear, move aside. Let me handle this. This was her chance. As Thomas turned his head to look at his mother, distracted for a single crucial second, Clara acted. She didn't lunge at them. She threw the heavy cookbook with all her might at the large, ornate lamp on the desk. The lamp crashed to the floor in a shower of sparks and shattering porcelain, plunging half the room into darkness. In the ensuing confusion, she scrambled for the fireplace. She yanked away the decorative screen and clawed at the soot-stained bricks, searching for the flue handle. Her fingers found a cold iron lever. She pulled. It was rusted tight. She threw her entire body weight against it, groaning with the effort. With a screech of tortured metal, it gave way, and a shower of soot and debris rained down on her. Above, she could see a faint, gray square of evening sky. "She's in the chimney!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice finally losing its composure. Clara didn't hesitate. She clambered into the fireplace, the rough bricks tearing at her clothes and skin. She began to climb, her feet finding purchase on the jagged edges, her hands raw and bleeding. It was a tight, suffocating space, filled with the stench of soot and ages. She could hear Thomas and Beatrice shouting below her, their voices echoing up the narrow flue. She climbed with a desperate, primal strength, fueled by pure terror. She was an animal clawing its way out of a trap. Finally, her hand broke through into the cool night air. She hauled herself up and over the edge, collapsing onto the steep, slate-shingled roof of the gables, gasping for breath, covered in blood and soot, but free. Below her, the house seemed to sigh, a disappointed beast. She didn't wait. She scrambled down the roof, half sliding, half climbing, until she reached the edge above the back porch. It was a 15-foot drop to the manicured lawn below. Without a second thought, she jumped. She landed hard, a searing pain shooting through her ankle, but she barely felt it. She got to her feet and ran. She ran without looking back, across the pristine lawn, past the eerily vibrant rose bushes, and into the dark woods that bordered the property. She ran until her lungs burned and her ankles screamed in protest, until the watchful silhouette of the gables was finally lost behind the trees. The epilogue of Clara's story was written not in a cookbook, but in a police report. She was found hours later on the side of a country road by a passing motorist, a wild, hysterical figure babbling about recipes and murder. The police were skeptical at first, but the terror in her eyes was real. And when they went to investigate the gables, they found a house that was eerily quiet. Beatrice and Thomas were gone. They had vanished, but they had left things behind in their haste. The investigation of the house uncovered horrors that would haunt the town of Oakhaven for generations. They found the butcher's ledger. They found the Macabre cookbook. And when they finally broke open the locked shed in the garden, they found bags of Beatrice's special fertilizer. Analysis would later confirm it was composed of nitrate-rich, pulverized human bone. They excavated the garden, and they found Amelia and a dozen other women, their bones feeding the roots of Beatrice's prize-winning roses. Beatrice and Thomas were never found. Some say they simply disappeared, moving on to find a new town, a new house, and a new tradition. But the story of the mother-in-law's horror recipe became a permanent, grisly legend in Oakhaven. The Gables was eventually torn down, but no one would ever build on that land again. And for years afterwards, no one in town could bring themselves to eat a homemade meat pie. They understood, finally, the terrible price of a family's secret ingredient, and the chilling truth that the most monstrous evils are often hidden behind a welcoming door, a warm kitchen, and the terrifying, domestic smile of a mother's love.